My role in this project is creating the prefabricated building walls.
I've been working on the business aspect of the project.
I was in charge of working on the water management.
My roles in this project is based on the energy system for the house.
Some kids take real pride in having a 98 in red ink with a smiley face on a piece of paper. But most of us, when you think back to high school, the things you remember are not that test. It's something real that you did. And our question is, why can't school be based on that?
What if your lessons consistently improve students' performance to never before seen levels? What if they engage students in authentic learning tasks that they really cared about? What if they allowed for more individual and small group instruction on your part, which lets you differentiate your lessons better? And what if they were just really, really fun? I'm about to tell you a little bit about that. This is Best Practices for PBL Planning. I am Sam Barnett. Here we go. So what is PBL? Most of us who are going to be watching this have been exposed to PBL already. So just for those of us who may be not quick, basically PBL stands for PBL unit. It differs from a traditional academic unit, quote unquote, because in it, students and teachers identify a real world problem that matters to them, and they address it by completing a project. You teach content and skills through this framework. So everything is taught through the framework of completing this specific project. So why use PBL? It leads to greater student mastery and greater student engagement. They've actually done studies that have identified both those things as meaningful outcomes of PBL units. They do better than traditional academic units do. And I included this quote as well from a guy named Jeff Robin, who is a sort of leading national thinker about PBL planning and implementation. Making, doing, and collaborating are the skills that project-based learning exemplifies. And I included that because those are also the skills that the 21st century workforce really requires, as we've learned in this class and others. PBL units are really well suited towards helping students achieve the skills they will need for the rest of their lives. So the first step in PBL follows a very backwards mapped approach, if you're familiar with Wiggins and McTee. So you start with the end in mind and you work backwards. The first step is creating a project. So how do you do so? You need to identify a relevant problem, relevant to your students, something that they will actually care about. And you can do a lot of different things with that, but they've got to have some intrinsic motivation or it's not really going to work. You need to set up a realistic scenario, and realistic means something that could potentially happen in real life. Not necessarily in your students' real lives, but it is a feasible real-world solution. In other words, there's no magic involved. There are no aliens involved, unless you're watching this in the future and we've discovered aliens already. And lastly, it incorporates some adult or real-world tools. Things that a good way to think about this is it should use tools that a professional as an adult would use in their circumstances, in the course of doing their job. So for instance, in this picture you have a teacher doing a robotics lesson with a class, and they're actually using motors and the robotic tools that an engineer who's building a robot would use. There's a whole lot of different ways you can go about doing this, and this is obviously a 30,000-foot view. Just for future reference, I'll include this here. This is a rubric, actually, that is developed by this organization called the Buck Institute. You can go to find the Buck Institute at www.bie.org. And one of the many resources for PBL planning and implementation that they have is actually a rubric where you can evaluate how strong the project you have come up with is. So this is like a self-reflection tool for teachers, and the link to it is here on the right. So how do I go about planning a PBL unit? I've got my project set, but how do I actually set the wheels in motion? The very first and one of the most important things, according to that PBL guru, Jeff Robin, I mentioned earlier, is to do the project yourself. That's so critical, and the reason it is so critical is because it helps you understand where some trouble spots might be, where some issues for your students might come up so that you can be better positioned to help them as they move through the unit. So there's, moving even a little bit past that, there are 3 different portions or 3 different segments in a PBL unit. The first is the before, then you have the during, and then you have the after. And each of these segments means something different. So in the before, you haven't really started the content learning yet. Your job here is to sort of lay the groundwork. So you are going to hook students in some way. You are going to establish an inquiry mindset. Especially if your kids aren't used to PBL, this is the first time you've done it in your class, they're not necessarily going to understand what you're doing. They're very trained, just like many of us were, at least I was in my education, to think about learning as sort of just this accumulation of facts. So you need to sort of be very explicit in teaching them that, no, we are going to be going about an inquiry-based approach to this. Lay out the process and deadlines. Something I've actually done in my class is to, if you're working in groups, have students complete both a group contract in which they set norms for themselves about things like communication, workload sharing, etc., and also to pick deadlines. And I've actually had students pick their own deadlines. I experimented with that a little bit. Me and my co-resident did it in a class we taught this year. It worked for some, it didn't work for some, but it's something interesting to try. And the last thing, of course, is model, model, model. This, again, goes back to do the project yourself. It's really helpful if on day 1 you can say to the kids, here is what I did, here is the finished project that you will have created a few weeks from now. So then we move on to during. This is sort of the thing that most closely resembles a traditional lesson, a traditional classroom setting. Less from the teacher, more from the students. This is inquiry-based. At this point, you're teaching content, you're teaching skills, you're introducing unit vocabulary, all those things that we traditionally think of as a teacher's role. In addition to that, there's a lot of sort of student-driven time in this, and your job as a teacher during those classroom sessions when the kids are working independently towards the completion of their projects is to give feedback and allow for revision. Formative assessment is key to effective PBL planning. And then we get to the after. So once kids have actually completed their projects, there should be some sort of exhibition, and ideally that exhibition should be public. So maybe students are presenting and pitching an idea to the school board. Maybe you have a sort of on a Thursday night, maybe you have all their parents come in and they do some presentations of skits or whatever they've been working on. Something that gets them up in front of people outside of the 4 walls of your classroom space. And then lastly, this is really important too, is that to really cement the learning, there should be some reflection. So kids can reflect on both the project process and the results. In other words, what did I do? How did things turn out? And do I like that? And then how could things have gone differently? How could I have done better? How could I have completed this project better? One thing that I've found is really powerful in this portion, this is just my own personal experience here, is to give them an opportunity to critique you as a teacher as well. So I asked kids at the end of one unit in which we completed a project, if you were going to teach this unit, what would you do differently than how we did? And they really responded to that, and the feedback they gave was really meaningful and thoughtful. So I'm going to go piece by piece here, before, during, and after, and drill down just a little bit more for you. I've got this hook graphic on the left because the important part of the before is that hook. So one way that you can kind of hook students in is to use an entry document to give them this as sort of quote-unquote initial spark. The entry document I had was that little YouTube video that I had at the very start of this. It can be something as simple as that. Another thing that, so I planned with a mentor teacher this year at one point, we were doing a unit on health. And the essential question was essentially, how can communities ensure healthy members? But we had to get the kids first to understand what a healthy member looks like. So to do that, we had them take life expectancy quizzes for themselves and figure out how long they're supposed to live. And it really messed with some of their minds. It was a lot of fun. Prior knowledge can be big here as well. So like a know and a need to know list, something that we probably, many of us use a lot. And I mentioned the contract before, that's super critical. Also introduce the rubrics at this point. It's really effective to have rubrics. Obviously for the final assessment, you're gonna have rubrics, but have some rubrics for other stuff too. Some teachers that I encountered throughout the research of this project use things like rubrics for group work, rubrics for discussions, rubrics for self-driven time, all kinds of different ways to sort of keep students evaluating themselves and self-assessing and self-critiquing and staying on task and all those good things. So how do I plan the middle part then? Again, this is the thing that we are probably most familiar with, any of us who has gone through the American education system, unless you were at a really way more awesome school than I was. The scaffolding of necessary skills and content knowledge that we're accustomed to and which we all have experience in. Each lesson ideally should move students closer to the completion of their final project. So it's really helpful to have some sort of small portion or product of that final project completed in a given lesson. And again, make time for formative assessment. Give structure in and build in and plan in times for you to give the kids feedback and for them to act on that feedback. And what I do at the after. This is a picture of what a potential after quote-unquote session could look like. You've got your critique and revision. Again, you've got that public product. They're doing some sort of public demonstration in front of people who are not just their classmates and you as the teacher. And they've got the reflection. And this sort of class circle that you see in this image is one example of what that reflection could look like. I saw one other video actually that I thought was really cool. The reflection portion, they all sat in a circle just like here, but the kids actually put the product in the middle of this circle, and so it was like sort of this like almost like quasi-spiritual vibe as they sort of sat around and talked about these things that they created, which were you know, touchable. They were right there in the middle of the circle. I thought that was cool. So to sum up, again, these are just the key points for you. Get a relevant real-world problem. Design a project which addresses that relevant real-world problem in some way. Introduce your project. Set about the active inquiry. And again, that exhibition and reflection on the back end is super, super key. Here are some additional resources for you. 3 that I found particularly useful as I went about this unit. Edutopia on PBL. That's the link. The Buck Institute, again, there's a link. And lastly, my friend Jeff Robin, who is a great thinker on this, nationally recognized. That's his website. All 3 of these, you know, you can hit pause and jot them down if you want to have these websites for the future. And that is it. Thank you very much.